going to be moving right along here, and I see him making his way up. Oh. He was up here earlier. Appreciate you coming back up here to give the next keynote, and it's going to be about why ESG is fundamental to blockchain and the future of payments. Yeah, if you're mic'd up, sure, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. I'll keep it informal. I know it's almost towards the end of the day, and you probably, it's me between me and cocktail, maybe one more presentation. So they asked me, this is all last minute, they asked me, can you really do a complicated presentation? So I started out with payments, right? And then we said, how do we make it more complicated? I said, let's throw in blockchain too. And they said, this is not complicated enough. What else can we do? I said, how about we throw in ESG in there too? And that'll have enough complexity in it for us to be able to talk about this. So I'm going to spend, again, those three topics, payments, ESG, and blockchain. Try to keep it interactive. It's a lot of content. I have about 300 slides, and I have about 30 minutes. So it's going to be about literally 10 minutes or 10 slides per minute. So, and I can't speak fast, as you know. So I'll be able to handle all that speed. So a few things. Why is ESG fundamental? If there's anything you should look into is the last slide, and I'll go backwards in time in giving you the gist of it, because I fear I may not be able to complete the entire presentation. Thank you. That's right. The joke was, yes, I'm ex-IBMer, so we still have the bad habits of long slides. But again, these are complicated topics, so I have to do this. The three things you have to know about this, the gist of this presentation is, one, whatever we're getting into with digital assets and payment space, there's a massive amount of data and massive amount of real-time processing. And that means a massive amount of computing. And that means the E part of the ESG is a lot of compute power, a lot of heat, a lot of energy, and there's a whole energy equation in terms of the source of energy and how do we dissipate that energy. So that's the data point number one. So whatever I'll talk about, I'll give you some history of genesis of why I'm talking about tokenization, why payment systems are becoming more and more complicated, why is the element of theft and financial crimes and market data that's tied to these transaction systems are so complicated. Second thing is, we do aspire for, this is the S part of the ESG, which is, by the way, everybody knows ESG here, right? So it's environmental, social, and governance. Essentially, you have UN SDG, which I'll discuss a bit. The whole idea is when we do business, can it be environmentally friendly? Are we keeping in mind all the social mores and all we are keeping in mind doing good for the community that we operate in? And governance is, are we doing the right governance? Which means there's no nefarious activities, there's no other elements happening. So the question is, we are building most of these blockchain payment systems, blockchain systems are global, transparent, open systems. And the reason why I focus on the second part, which is the social element of this, is it's meant to be inclusive. It's meant to include the remaining part of the world who wants to get on this global financial platform and ability for you to be able to transact with this platform. That's what the second is all about, that if you're just like internet, which is a truly global system, and internet-enabled information access and internet-enabled education, internet-enabled ability for us to communicate, well, some of that is dysfunctional today, but nonetheless, it was a massive global system, and if we aspire to do the same thing for financial services, or for onboarding the various entities who are on the fringes of the society, it's a global system, it's open network, and that has a cost. It has a cost both in terms of, we discuss privacy, but it also has a cost of maintaining this massive system in terms of energy that goes into it. And then you have the element of redesign the global financial system, which is happening in parallel. And I'll give an example in this case in terms of crypto, that today if you had an Ether in the US, you had Ether in Vietnam, you had Ether in India, the cost of doing business is exactly the same. The rules of engagement are exactly the same. We living in the West or living in the United States don't have undue advantage of the capital markets and access to capital markets that we have. And that is the power of an egalitarian system, that we are ability for us to be able to not only move things of value in real time, but also, and things of value could be payment, it could be money, but that will mean that you need to have a system that has built-in non-repudiance, it has built-in security, it has built-in global footprint. And you have to make sure the protocol itself has security built into it. All the things that was mentioned the previous speaker. So that's the essence of this. So if there's three things you need to take away from this 30 minutes of a lot of slides and a lot of conversation, is these three things. Now let me go back to the starting point. If I can move the slides, or can you move it to slide 1? Any questions so far? I'm trying to fill air here. So a few things.
You said that there may be trade-offs in the short term, but that in the long term we're going to meet our objectives. So how do we go past ESG trade-offs to how we are going to get past massive computing for environmental impact?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a few things. Before things become better, they become worse, which means we have to expend the energy for us to, at technical level, there's a lot of work done I'm a technical guy, right? So we're looking into what can we do from privacy preservation technology perspective, what can we do to make protocols better, more efficient in communication, right? And people throw the word quantum like it's candy, but you don't know ESG till you actually see quantum and how much energy quantum uses, right? And if you look at Google search uses more energy today than Bitcoin does. But as a human quest to learn more, we don't stop searching. So the question then becomes is what can we do to build this global system that is well understood? It's truly global in nature. It is established before we begin to improvise on energy quotient. Second thing is we've always addressed the supply side of energy, but not the demand side of energy. Or rather, the other way around. We've addressed the demand side, but not the supply side, in the sense that why don't we embark on clean energy to begin with, and then we don't have to worry about these challenges as a entry point. So a few things. What is token-driven revolution? And I discern between digitalization and tokenization that everything is being tokenized. I mean, we had a gentleman who was, I'm sorry to pick you on this, but the whole element was we're going to negate the need for landfills. And you can't. There are some physics element of it, this life that we live and we do a few things, but we're trying to tokenize the world. The answer to everything is let's tokenize it. And so the question I went and asked myself is what gives token its value? And it's not new. I mean, we've looked at this in terms of casinos, which is always a bad example to give, by the way, in blockchain context. Blockchain already has enough, notoriety around it. And so the element of paper tickets gives you access rights to watch a movie, digital rights management. You go to a amusement park, you have a token that gives you access to rights, which reduces complexity in terms of payments. So there's a whole element of why we've had tokenization for the longest time, but it is not digital token. These were tokens that you would procure from many of the other entities, and they basically represented some asset, whether it's rights or some asset like in form of value. And that's essentially what tokens did for us. So it's old. And it fundamentally did two things for us. It hid all the complexity. This is the amusement park use case. You go to amusement park, you had some pass, and you showed the pass. You didn't have to pay a fee for every single ride. You simply said that this ride is 2 tokens versus 3 tokens. You had a whole pocket full of tokens, and you used those elements. So it basically found a new business model to say we need a token, and token makes things more easier. They're exchangeable, they're fungible. And second thing it did was it did something super interesting. It hid, which is what your fiat bill is. It gives you the capability to hide complexity, but also add store of value. So a token had some value that it gave, whether you exchange that value for fiat and exchange it back into fiat. So these are some of the fundamental elements that will lead to what I'm going to talk about in a few. So some of the benefits of digital tokens, right, is, again, we can compare this to all forms of payments. Unit of account, store of value, medium of exchange, an ability for us to be able to ensure that it's not only cheaper, faster, better, but it does something for the system for us to be able to provide fractional value, allows us to be able to have automated, which is what we are spending. So this is, again, the E agenda of it, is we spend so much money and people and time and technology in audit records. We spend so much time in terms of figuring out as to who's responsible for what. These are all audit elements and audit trails, which is built into a technical framework, which negates the need of us having to build separate parallel systems which does different things. And not only it's inefficient, but it's also, in terms of building a system, it's quite comparatively expensive to do. So in many cases, the process of converting an asset into something of value is asset tokenization. It's a digital representation, and this is, again, it could be a house, it could be a car, it could be your identity, your driver's license. That's the process. What is the business behind it? And this is something which I wrote extensively about, is who's making money, who are the protocol entities, and basically it's important to understand the people who are making money in this space, who are competing with the existing payment systems, existing rails, existing businesses, are the parallels that you have in the analog world in the digital world. These are exchanges. These are folks who are in the process of creating tokens. These are startup companies who are sort of, again, USDC was a startup company. Today they are processing over what, if I'm not mistaken, close to about $130 billion worth of stable coins, which are used for payments today. They didn't exist 6 years back or 8 years back. So these are understanding the exchange vehicles is what are the rails, what is the infrastructure where we move these tokens, what gives token its value, who are the companies behind it, that is the business, right? And in many cases, be under no illusion that much of this is really competing with our existing financial infrastructure, which means much of that is actually giving head-on alternative to existing financial system. And I have n number of personal experience that I've gone through just to test that system, and it has always come out to be more positive experience, with the exception of some clunky element that happen every now and then. So the question that I ask myself is, so what is the disruption here? Will we have existing CBD, will we have existing fiat? Of course we will. Will we have existing payment rails and credit cards? We will. But we'll also have alternatives. And so the question about disruption is the ability for me to be able to find, which is what I mentioned in the panel, was not, today I rely upon fiat as the only entity for us to be able to get into as a medium of exchange. But what if I had hundreds of those? Which is the case today. If you look at most of the crypto exchanges, I have dealt with this. Your NFTs, non-fungible tokens, could be medium of exchange. Your Bitcoin could be medium of exchange. Your Ether, many of the ERC20 tokens, including the stable coins, they all represent movement of value, which means you're no longer tied to USD movement as a payment instrument. And that concept is quite profound. That suddenly the landscape of payment itself is changing, and that payment shift of understanding what is of value and what I'm willing to accept as a medium of exchange basically leads to this massive infrastructure in form of rails, which is blockchain, DLT, which is truly global system, looking into various systems that are keeping them safe. These are digital asset custody solutions, platforms that generate these tokens so you can then verify, validate. That's asset tokenization platform, and that essentially is the disruption that the industry is going through. So there's certainly some element of disintermediation happening. It's a matter of the fact, just like with internet and information economy, that you no longer have travel agents, which, by the way, does anybody use travel agents? I'm just curious. There's always one guy who says, I'm using it. I'm like, where do you find them? Where do you find travel agents?
They specialize in really complicated trips, like the Galapagos or Egypt.
Excuse me. Excuse me. But the point I'm trying to make here is that you generally don't go through a travel agent now, but you still go through Expedia and Trivago and this Galapagos, the billion-dollar vacation that you go through. But the whole point there is that there are experience managers. They want to manage your experience. They're not just selling you a ticket, right? And that is the disruption we have to understand, that the future of folks who are involved in this payments industries, who are looking at these sort of areas, who are all these technical areas that I mentioned in terms of rails, asset tokenization, digital asset custody, they're curating your experience to give you a better payment experience. It's not just about movement of value or exchange of value. And that is the disruption that we have to understand, that it's not simply making it better, secure, and faster, and let's use a mobile app for it. It's what are the intrinsic value of the system that's being built. And the question you have to ask yourself is, where are you in that line to be disintermediated? So new world, new design. I'll say this with one slide. You'll have to access slides. I generally don't like to talk to slides. I have a lot of those, but I don't like to talk to them. Is that I always look at three things. One is, what am I tokenizing? What gives my token its value? And what is the underlying asset behind it? Those are the three things you need to know. Only because you have a lot of FUD factor, you have a lot of stuff happening out there, a lot of promise in terms of this token is of value, because if you're using something as a payment instrument, it has to have intrinsic, inherent value. Second thing is, which is another disruption, that today we look at tokens as bankable assets. These are the assets that banks have risk models, bank has valuation techniques to say you have a stock, you have a house, you have a car, you have something of value that I can equate and measure. But you have a lot of stuff that is still of value, but it's only valuable to you or to a small sect of people. That's the non-bankable assets. These are your heirlooms, things that maybe your patent or your NFL rings, for example. These are non-bankable assets. Banks don't have a risk model or evaluation criteria to be able to value these things and get into financial primitives of borrowing and lending. So the class of these assets are very, very large. So if you go back to the previous moniker of the fact that you have things of value, payment instruments that are not traditional payment instruments, the question we should ask ourselves is, what is the valuation of these assets that exist today that are being tokenized? So this is, again, a question of real estate, fractionalized real estates. Things if I want to mortgage my house or borrow the collateral against my house, can I find that a small fraction of it, instead of going to traditional banking and spending all that money to be able to do it, I should be able to take a small fraction of it and be able to borrow against and get into financial primitives, borrowing, lending, and other activities that go with it, which I think we did some math, rough, behind the napkin math, that existing asset classes are $471 trillion. Does anybody want to guess what is, again, behind the napkin calculation, what is the math behind the non-bankable assets? It's a guess. You cannot go wrong with it. Gazillions. We have the man of the answer here. It's quadrillion, actually. Now, I don't know what the difference is between gazillion and quadrillion. It's a lot of zeros. But a trillion is a quadrillion. So it's about $2.2 quadrillion worth of assets. These are people who have gold. I'm from India. Gold is big in our societies, and that oftentimes leads to things that are not exactly bankable, right? The gold is, but ornaments are not. So again, I go back to internet. This is a pretty old slide. Look into how protocols have made money. This has a method to it, madness. I'll leave it here for now. Basically, these are different layers. Each of them have their tokens, which means if you have a token on layer 4, layer 5, it has to be all-encompassing of value of underlying layers. Same thing with decentralized finance. There's a lot of content here. There's a paper behind each of these things. But I just want to bring the complexity of the system that each of these layers have their own set of tokens. Each of the layers have hundreds of projects. Each projects have their own tokens, which is making this world enormously complex. The question becomes is, we are constantly using these tokens inside out. They've been used in liquidity pools. They've been using automated market makers, making tools. And we are sort of moving value in and out, which means that they all have, at some point, become payment instruments. So this was I'm getting now into the ESG part of it. I don't know how much time do I have. Oh, I have a lot of time. So this is a banner year. This is between last 2 years. You find some interesting names, mostly payment entities, because again, they need to understand the rails. They need to understand what is the underlying infrastructure that's providing this, and all these entities, and I have personally worked with many of them. Some of them are here, you know who you are. In many cases to see what is their role and what is the end of that disruption that they're going through. What role they can play, how they can morph. That essentially this is the past 2 years, things are changing again. But this is a bit dated slide, but I just want to give you a perspective that most of these, as you'll see, are payment companies. The scenarios that guide my principle, and again, I've put the entire enchilada here, is I'm looking at this from a systems perspective, which means that I have to have some elements of what is tokenizing my asset. I'm looking at the market infrastructure, which are the rails. And I gave an example in the past that most countries have their own payment rails and they have payment systems, but you don't have a global system, which means that as long as our asset is trapped in ledgers, we are having to reconcile the ledgers, which leads to relay of these ledgers. And if you're going towards a tokenized model, then you suddenly are flattening that business process that's spread across not just banks, but different countries. That is the market infrastructure, which is a true disruption. Reg and comp, important part. Whatever we do, we're moving value. We have to make sure that we're within the confines of the law. And in many cases, we have to make sure that we don't have a bookend problem. So if you're designing a system on this global infrastructure, you've got to make sure that you're adhering to the corridors that you're operating in and the laws that each of the tail end of that corridors have. And that's the area, whether it's auditing, whether it's reporting, whether it's financial stability, and so on and so forth. Because you're not dealing with just ledger entries, you're dealing with tokenized form of assets, you've got to keep them safe. And that's the digital asset custody piece of it. So this is the holistic list of things that either you're involved with or you're going to be needing these services as you get in the space. And these are the new business model, new players coming into the space, while much of this doesn't exist or may not exist in existing infrastructure. And then what you see in the box is essentially where things move, the digital transactions. We have Central bank digital currencies, you have stable coins, you have private monies, you have internal tokens, you have closed loop token systems that are evolving, which again are trying to solve and remove the friction from payments per se. Going after security settlement. So you must have heard of finality. These are hundreds of millions of dollars of monies that are used for settling securities. And the question then becomes is, how can they do this more efficiently in a cross-border format? But that's a lot of money to be able to move overnight in real-time payment systems. So real-time is the logic, is the key word. And many of these settlement systems and wholesale settlement systems, PVP systems, DVP systems, which is delivery versus payment or payment versus payment systems, these are, what you see in the box are essentially the payment agenda. And what you see on the left-hand side is the real-time element of it. Because if it's still taking the same amount of time it takes today, if it takes 7 days for me to clear securities, or 14 days in some cases, then what have I really solved? So if I move from 7 days to an hour, or same day, or real time, suddenly now I've changed the equation of velocity of movement of money, velocity of movement of value, and that is the disruption that we're talking about here. Thank you. I thought that was like very exciting, like this is great. I love it. Can I get some more of those? Well, keeps me motivated. Thank you again. And as I'm looking at this from a technology perspective, I'm trying to find out what is the underlying infrastructure do I need, right? So again, you need the infrastructure. So this will not happen in a vacuum. This will still rely upon your cloud technology. This will still rely upon your high-speed networks, still rely upon your faster processing that you would need. And I would say that if you're, so everybody's a tech company, right? You all have different focus, different licensing, different areas that you want to fix and improve. So you need to find a focus. And I put the digital asset and payment platform as a focus that you need to understand what you're trying to solve for. Are you trying for real-time domestic retail payment systems? Are you trying to go for cross-border security settlement, cross-border remittances? What is that swim lane that you want to address? And everything else becomes domain-specific on top of that. So you pick your swim lane, and that includes if you simply want to solve the regulatory and compliance piece of the equation, then how do you understand the underlying global infrastructure? How do you keep tab on these transactions being processed in this infrastructure? How do you keep tab of the various wallets, various elements that are emerging, and solve for that problem? So to me, that's the technology focus areas, that it's not just about, which I get this a lot, that you have a wallet, you have a private key, you have a token, and the story revolves around these three constructs. That, hey, I was able to move the asset, it was quick, fast, it was great, and I have to maintain the key, I have a MetaMask wallet. But the point I'm trying to make is there's a lot more to it underneath the covers because you're trying to solve a business problem. You're not simply trying to move a Bitcoin or move an Ether from wallet A to wallet B. It has to be tied with other facets of doing business around it, which means you need to have identity, you need to buy things, you need to sell things, you need to have a duality of a transaction to make sure that if you're transferring value, you're getting something in return. Because there's never a one-way movement of money. There's always an exchange that happens in return. I'll leave this alone. I have said this for the longest time. I've adopted this. Even my new role is a 3I, which is looking into what is the infrastructure do I need. You have many instrument classes, NFTs, non-fungible tokens, fungible tokens, stable coins, cryptocurrencies, crypto assets. There's a whole plethora of new verbiage and terminology and new asset classes that are emerging. So I use them as instruments. And the reason why it helps me is because somebody asked me a question between what is the easy way to classify between a security and a commodity and a payment instrument as a starting point. And the question then becomes, is that instrument area allows me to build swim lanes to say, while I may have the same infrastructure, I may be able to move tokens, move value, move assets. I should have that regulatory focus to treat an instrument that may be a security, an instrument that may be a commodity, an instrument that may be a payment instrument. And how do I treat them separately from a regulatory and compliance perspective? That means reporting, that means additional criteria that you need, and all this is processing, by the way. And intelligence, financial crimes, market data. How do I know if I'm storing a Bitcoin, what is the value of a Bitcoin? Because if you don't know what you're storing, how do you identify the risk with it? What happens if you lose those coins because of a hack or because of a vulnerability that you may have? So it's important for you to understand the value at risk of these assets, regardless of what you're doing, because that's how you determine how to safeguard your network, safeguard your infrastructure, safeguard your investments. And this is, again, the mapping of those activities that you may have to be involved in from a digital asset perspective. So this is the last part. which is the ESG piece, and we'll open for Q&A, right? So I took some lessons from what are others doing? Like how do you make ESG cool and sexy in payments? So I looked into areas of like, candy. You buy candy, they give you the footprint, whether it's calories or sugar, and sugar is sourced from Brazil. Brazil is deforestation, the whole area, and you have all these labels which makes it fun, and they have color-coded it. Not only the private companies, but even UN. They have SDG agenda, which is where the genesis of these things came up, in looking into the 17 criteria for sustainable development goals. Of course, not everything is ESG related, but the whole idea there is that you want to focus on economic inclusion, you want to focus on environment, you want to focus on social development, innovation. So many of these boxes sort of fit into the whole overall ESG agenda per se. So that's the scope of things we're dealing with. So I looked at the previous slide in terms of what is the food industry doing, what is the candy industry doing, what are the other industry, which is easier for them to capture these things. What are they doing versus the overall sustainability goals that we have set forth as a global agenda. And it all boils down to data. For you to come up with these pretty pictures and pretty graphs, you need data. And data is improving. And in fact, my last few years in my previous role, I spent some time in understanding as to how do you incorporate the environmental impact, the carbon capture, into financial modeling. Because that'll give you direct access to saying, if I'm moving a stock from point A to point B, that's the cost of doing that. So data is improving. And if you look at, again, I have no idea why that's the case, but it has become a Federal Reserve mandate for ESG improvement. Looked into central banks looking at ESG data, which means it's a priority. Which, by the way, how many of you really care about ESG? I should have asked this up front. No, really care. Come on. Really care about ESG. We all should, right, at some point. Thank you. But how do we make sense of this whole thing? And the way I have tried to chunk this up is, if Bitcoin is expensive, which helps me move value within a matter of minutes, then can we take the sum total of all the transaction that we do cross-border between 6 and 12 different financial institutions, their data centers, their ledger reconciliations, and sum total of that per transaction, and compare that with every single transaction we process in DLT world. And that will be a true comparison. That includes SWIFT, that's in between. That includes the regional banks. That includes what we have to do to maintain our infrastructure, maintain security, and so on and so forth. So it is an agenda. It is an agenda, but my only problem with this is that we are only focused on carbon. We only focus on the E part of it and not S and G. And I think that is something we should look at this holistically from social and governance point of view, and not simply going towards hiring practices. It has to be holistic in nature, I think. So going back to my first slide, is at the end of the day, it's a lot of data, a lot of processing, and the question becomes, how do I take this and integrate them into my financial modeling? So can I become like a candy vendor, that I can include that every time you process a payment, you have a carbon cost, like airlines do now, you can buy carbon credits? Is that one way to solve the problem, or is just one way to feel good? And maybe you can answer some of the question in terms of the carbon credits that you brought up. So to me, it's about data. It's about you're building financial system. Financial system touches all of us. Payments, to me, is the ultimate form of vote that we cast. Payment is really, really important part. In fact, we've discussed this in the CBDC context, that it should be a human right, access to money. And this became quite evident when we had speakers coming from Venezuela, from Zimbabwe, where they couldn't simply get paid for things they did because of geopolitical issues and so on and so forth. So that is a social agenda that we should look into. And from governance perspective, is how can we govern all this right, address the right issues? I think we are, as an industry in general, we are focusing more on narratives than solving the problem. So those are the few messaging that I had for this session. I hope you have memorized all the slides, taken all the pictures, and you'll text me about it, and I'll answer each and every one of those. I'm just kidding. I'm not answering anything. Any question? That's all I had, by the way. I hope those 440 slides went really fast. Questions, comments, concerns, critique? Go ahead, please. Ladies first. We'll come to you later.
So in the lending and asset management industries, Scope 3 emissions requires them to measure finance emissions. right? Or is it just, it's actually scope 1 because it's the emissions from the processing, the compute.
Yeah.
It's like that, I'm finding that in dealing with asset managers and lenders, that challenge to measure the scope 3 is driving a lot of activity.
Correct.
And mapping all of this,
Yeah.
but I'm not seeing that in the payments.
Yeah. So that's a brilliant question, by the way. And it's systemic in nature, right? So this all started with BlackRock. If you remember back in the day, Larry Fink talked about this on open stage, and next thing you know, they invested in a project that wiped out area of Jamaica in Brazil rainforests, right? So two things. One thing is that to incorporate carbon capture, incorporate the data that pertains to the environmental impact of whatever we're doing. So we're lending for a project, a shopping mall, or whatever the case is. That's the footprint of the project. You rely upon the project developers to give you that data. I think when you track money, this is where payment comes into play. And payment is important and vital, and that's why most governments, including India and US and China, holding on to the payment system, because payment systems are the ultimate system of control that define where the money is going. And so if you look at what the developers have claimed the SDG goals to be, and you look at the payments that's going out, I think it's an easy way to measure the impact and what they claim to be. So while payment system itself, so there are two aspects of this scope 3 that you talked about. One is the impact of payment system itself. Is it expensive? Is it environmentally unfriendly for us to move money? Right? So is email. Right? So is Google search, as I mentioned. And so is moving cash around, absolutely. So there's cost of maintaining those global systems versus the measurement that we apply to these transactions that are happening around the world. And I think payments is the best way to do it, that if we are able to track and trace every single payment and find the footprint of each payment, both in terms of the intrinsic cost of processing, but also what the payment is going towards, I think you'll solve a lot more issues without actually focusing on industries per se. Because now we can say that, hey, no matter what you pay for sugarcane, it's bad. I have nothing against sugarcane, I'm just saying that it's just bad. It's sweet, it's sugar, people eat a lot of it, and it has a health impact. So you can have a downstream impact and upstream impact for what you're paying for, which is a scope 3, if that makes sense. So it's a little bit convoluted, but we have to get to that point, and I think it's just a matter of obtaining that level of data for us to be able to get to it.
You're at State, which bank are you at?
No one's heard of it, don't worry about it. State Street.
State Street.
Yeah.
So what's State Street doing to enable ESG besides obviously?
No, that's all right. I'm speaking in my personal capacity here, but I'll tell you, and this is something disclaimers that we all have to do working in the financial service industry. So State is the world's largest custody bank.
Largest?
Custody bank.
Okay.
Right, so we deal with capital markets, everything that we all love about Wall Street. That's us.
So, but what are they doing? Can you say? I mean, where are they in their journey with ESG?
I can say it, but it's probably not the right forum. We're doing all of the above in the sense we are understanding. Main thing is understanding the industry in general. In some cases, when you serve an industry, you have to understand what the industry requirements are and what can we do for ourselves as an industry. This is exactly what I was telling her, versus what you can do to serve the industry in that context. So because any entity that's involved in mid-office, back-office processing, you have to have a perspective on that, right? And the main thing that's lacking in this industry is data. It's becoming better, but you're relying upon self-reporting structures, which we all know it's not exactly a trustworthy source of information, if that makes sense. Somebody else had a question? Come on, go for it. I got a big applaud from here, and question from you.
This is more theoretical kind of thing. So,
Okay, I'm out of time.
almost every decade.
Okay, we're out of time now. We can discuss it. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, we've had some agenda from a climate standpoint. It's asset planning 1 years, and then there's always something, right? And so some of that is political agenda, some of that's governmental stuff. So what and kind of what you've outlined is almost a whole infrastructure processing and way to get to doing the right thing at the right time, and then validation and checks and balances against companies and whether they're actually doing that, right? And so there's, is it going to be around long enough to take root? Is half of that, and then the other side of it is once, government gets involved in, like when you were talking about the USDC stuff, there's a control element that I think in America will never go over. If you look at the clarity, even from a political standpoint, and just kind of measure that against control versus non-control, that's going to be a civil war. So it's just kind of interesting because I always struggle. I'm an efficiency guy. I'm a Six Sigma guy. So I constantly navigate to what you're talking about. That's the way to do it. That's the best way to do it. But unfortunately, what I've seen in this world is that the best way never really wins.
Is there
Typically, who has the most money.
is there a question there, or?
No, that's not it.
Just checking.
How do you rationalize sometimes
Yeah.
like that?
I think she has the same question, like, they have to coexist, the systems, and what we're building now, which means that, hey, we already have a system, it's working fine, and at some point you have a cutover. And I think, that also drives consumption and misconsumption of that information. So I think you're right to an extent, and you're right, the reason why I have black, because it's a very apolitical statement. You don't wear any colors, right? So I'm not going the politics of it, but I think you look into saying you always have to strive to do better. As builders, as technologists, as innovators, as startup guys. Let the politicians do what they feel is right, and we get to choose them. So, well, thank you for your time. Hopefully it made sense. So.